Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Morgan's weekly webinar series. Each Wednesday at 3 p.m., you could tune in for in-depth discussions with our curators and conservators about objects in the collection or exhibitions in progress. Next week, my colleague Joel Smith will be talking about a New York-based artist, Ray Johnson, and his relationship with photography. My name is Joshua O'Driscoll, and as Tony mentioned, I'm the Assistant Curator of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts at the Morgan Library. And today I'll be talking about one of the Morgan's absolute greatest treasures, the Lindau Gospels. This is a medieval handwritten copy of the four Gospels, which are, for Christians, the canonical accounts of the life of Christ. Because of their central role in the Christian religion, Gospel books like this were, in early medieval ages in particular, the focus of incredible care, labor, expense, and artistic embellishment. Now, before I get into the medieval aspects of this object, I want to talk a little bit about how it came to New York. When the Lindau Gospels was acquired in 1901 by Pierpont Morgan, it was an absolute sensation. It immediately put Morgan on the map as a major collector of illuminated manuscripts. Now, prior to this, he wasn't really known as a manuscript collector, an illuminated manuscript collector. He actually came to this rather late in his life. And I like to think that this object in particular, the Lindau Gospels, it's fitting that this was the object that really put him on the track to become a major collector of manuscripts, because this object combines two of his great passions as a collector, gems and metalwork. Not everybody knows that Pierpont Morgan was a passionate collector of precious gems. In fact, his collection forms one of the core collections of the Natural History Museum in New York, its collection of gems. And he's particularly famous as the donor of the Star of India sapphire, a particularly large sapphire. And he was also really well known as a collector of metalwork, and he was one of the first major collectors of medieval metalwork in the United States. Now, the Lindau Gospels gets its name from this abbey, the Lindau Abbey in Lake Constance. You can see it's at the very southern end of Germany, and it's an island monastery on Lake Constance. And the Gospel book was at Lindau Abbey since at least the 17th century. And it stayed there until the abbey was secularized in 1803. Secularization is a process in which a religious institution like a monastery would sort of stop becoming an independent religious institution, and its assets would be distributed either to the state or to private individuals. In the case of Lindau Abbey, its possessions were distributed among the nuns that were in the abbey. And the Lindau Gospels went to a Baroness Antonia von Ensberg. And when she died in 813, the manuscript was purchased by a well-known German collector of manuscripts, Baron Joseph von Lasberg, and he actually sold the manuscript in 1846. Now, it's not entirely clear why Lasberg sold the Lindau Gospels. He was primarily a collector of literary manuscripts. So the Lindau Gospels doesn't really have much in terms of literary value, so perhaps for that reason, he decided to part ways with it. And Lasberg sold it to an English collector, Lord Ashburnham, the fourth Earl of Ashburnham. And he was a famous bibliophile. He amassed an enormous collection of manuscripts, which his son sold off in a series of auctions. And the Lindau Gospels was one of the last objects in Ashburnham's collection, which was sold off. And at first it was attempted to sell it to the British Museum, but they couldn't meet the Ashburnham price, and Morgan actually stepped in and paid the price. In fact, Morgan was one of the few individuals at the time that was willing or able to pay the requested £10,000 for the manuscript. So, and at that point, he really started collecting manuscripts at a great pace, and by his death in 1913, 12 years later, he amassed a collection of over 600 manuscripts. His son Jack expanded on his collection and turned his library into a public institution. And its first director, Belle de Costa Green, also played a pivotal role in shaping the collection into what it is today, which is one of the world's leading collections of illuminated manuscripts. So now, where was the Lindau Gospels made? Well, according to legend, the Lindau Gospels, this is a centuries-old legend. The Lindau Gospels was commissioned by Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, in 834 to mark the foundation of the Abbey of Lindau. Now, this is a legend, and we know this is a legend because it doesn't really line up with historical facts. First of all, the abbey itself was founded earlier than that. And second of all, nothing about this manuscript lines up with what we know as the patronage of Louis the Pious. In fact, we know that the manuscript itself, the actual text part of the manuscript, was written and illuminated decades later, towards the end of the 9th century. You're looking here at the various parts of the Lindau Gospels. And one of the things that is most interesting about this object is that it is a composite object. So when it was first acquired, in line with this legend, it was thought that the manuscript was all of one piece. And as our knowledge of medieval art has progressed, it's become much clearer that we're dealing actually with many different types of art objects that were brought together to create this gospel book. On the left, you could see 2 spectacular covers, the front cover, the back cover. There are also these silk linings, the silk lining of the front cover here on the left, and the silk lining of the back cover. And then there's the actual illuminated manuscript itself. I'm showing you here only 4 representative examples. And one of the major debates among scholars is how and when did these various components come together to create the object that we know today? Some people are of the opinion that this bringing together happened later in its history, in perhaps the 16th century. This is the opinion of my predecessor, for example, Bill Volkley. Other scholars are of the opinion that this is very much a 9th century phenomenon. And this is what I will be presenting today. And I'll let you make your own decision. It's still very much a debate, and there's a lot of uncertainty about this manuscript. So I want to start by focusing on the treasure bindings of this manuscript, the front and back cover. So believe it or not, these 2 covers are actually over 100 years apart from each other in date, and were created in very different places. Just to go back to the map, you could see here Lindau, it's on the little red dot here. The other locations that we'll be looking at are St. Gall, which is on the other side of the lake, a little bit inland, and Salzburg, which is not on the map, but about 250 kilometers to the east, and then Saint-Denis, or Paris, which is about 500 kilometers to the northwest. So these objects come from very different times and places, and they were brought together likely in St. Gall towards the end of the 9th century. And what I'm going to talk about in my talk today is how we know what we know about this object. What are the reasons that scholars think the way they do about this object today? Now, before we get into that, I want to explain a little bit about what we mean by a treasure binding. And I'm showing you here just some examples of treasure bindings from the Morgan's collection. A treasure binding is, at its core, a type of a way of increasing the material value of a codex, of a manuscript. It's adding to the book to increase its value, turning it into a ceremonial object, a marker of status, and a symbol of power. Now, with this added material value to the codex, there's a lot of opportunity for loss and changes over time. In fact, it's really common when you're dealing with treasure bindings to have to think almost like an archaeologist and think about the layers of an object and how they change over time. It's very difficult to think about these things in their original state, which is at times a very problematic notion. And the other point that I want to make about treasure bindings is that it's a little bit of a misleading term. They're not actually bindings, they're covers. These are things that are attached to the physical binding of the manuscript. Oftentimes they're just nailed on, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. So talking about the various changes over time, this is definitely the case with the Lindau Gospels. I'm showing you here a representation of the repairs, and the restorations, and the additions that the back cover of the Lindau Gospel experienced over the centuries. This part in particular has experienced the most change over time. And you can see that there are a couple different components. Some of them are easy to date. So we know, for example, that these corner pieces here that were replaced in the late 16th century. These are depictions of the 4 evangelists. Other aspects of the repairs are a little bit harder to date, like these side panels, for example, the side right strip and the lower strip. Some scholars have suggested that these may even be Carolingian repairs dating to the 9th century, as are these here, but that's really difficult to determine. And there are different types of repairs too and replacements. You could see these pieces probably replace lost or damaged parts of the cover, whereas this strip here on the left was intended to expand the dimensions of the covers, the back cover, so it would match the dimensions of the later front cover. So the back cover wasn't the only part of the Lindau Gospels to experience change over time. I'm showing you here on the left a picture of the book's spine. And here you see its actual binding. So this is a really important view. And you could see that its binding is actually a 16th century leather binding. You can see the date right here, 1594. And this is presumably the date when the manuscript experienced a major restoration campaign, a complete rebinding. This involved taking the covers off of the boards, replacing the leather, the material that was covering the boards with this leather binding, and also a couple other features. If you look at the foredge here, you notice that the manuscript itself has been cut down. It's not flush with the covers as it originally would have been, and the edges have been gilt, and a pattern has been applied. It's hard to see, but if you could follow my mouse pointer, you could see this design here that's been applied to the foredge. That's called gophering. And so the gilt edges, the gophered edges, and the cropping of the manuscript all likely occurred when the rebinding happened in 1594, excuse me. Now the cropping is particularly unfortunate, and this is something that often happens during a rebinding, and we can get a little bit more into that process if you're interested to know more about that. But a lot of people have suggested that, as I mentioned earlier, that this date of 1594 may be the date when all of these pieces were put together. But there are reasons to think otherwise. So if you look at the back cover of the Lindau Gospels, one thing that is immediately clear is that so much of the design has been preserved, despite all of these restorations and changes over time. And it is, in my opinion, that whoever worked on this cover over the centuries tried their best to maintain the design of the cover, to preserve it as best they could. So the design is at its core based on a flared cross, you see, surrounded by an enamel frame. At the center of the cross, there is a precious stone. This is a topaz that has been replaced, but there likely was originally a stone here as well. Surrounding the stone, there's an inscription comprised of 4 nomina sacra. These are standard abbreviations of holy names. In this case, it says Jesus Christus Dominus Nostro, so Jesus Christ our Lord. And the arrangement of the inscription is interesting. It's 4 groups of 3 letters. This starts off a pervasive number symbolism that goes throughout the cover. And you'll notice that there are patterns of 4 everywhere. There are 4 identical medallions of Christ surrounding the centerpiece. There are 4 bosses in the middle of each plaque of the cover. And there are 4 evangelist symbols, assuming that's what originally was there, in the corners of the binding. So this design, this pattern of 4 points around a central point, is a really common way in early medieval art of stressing the 4-fold harmony of the Gospels. So that is, the 4 different Gospels are actually united and they agree with each other. So that's one element to the design of this cover. Another dimension of this cover is cosmological. So you could see here the letters on the vertical arm of the cross, they're Greek letters alpha and omega. They're here as well. These Greek letters symbolize the beginning and end of time, so already casting this in a cosmological dimension. Also, the 4 busts of Christ surrounding the centerpiece recall scientific diagrams from the period of the cardinal directions, the 4 rivers of paradise, and the 4 main winds. So again, this is another way of giving a global, a cosmological dimension to the cover. This idea, this theme is extended in the animal motifs in the binding. So if you look at the enamel frame, the original enamel frame, for example, you see beasts, various kinds, birds, fish, quadrupeds. These, as one scholar has suggested, are the beasts mentioned in the three main beasts mentioned in Genesis. This also applies to the most fantastic part of the cover, which are these 4 plaques that are full of writhing snakes and biting beasts. These likely point back to a primordial moment of creation. And if you take this together, you can see how the artist is trying to communicate that the gospel book is itself a source of life. That's eternal life in this case. So the design of the Lindau back cover is all the more impressive when you take into account how many different techniques are on view in this piece. There are not counting the restorations and the later editions, there are no fewer than 8 different metalwork techniques involved in the creation of this work. You can see up here at the top the cloisonné enamels and garnets. Here on the lower left, you see 2 kinds of champlevé enamel. Here, in the upper examples, the enamel forms the body of the beasts, and the gold forms the ground. In this lower piece, however, the enamel forms the background, and the gold forms the body of the beast. So you have this clever play between positive and negative space, and form and ground. For some scholars, these central medallions, these pierced relief medallions, are the most shocking part of the binding. They may be among the earliest examples of this pierced relief technique, which is otherwise almost entirely associated with Viking art and the art of Scandinavia. And they appear here quite early in date. In fact, it's been one of the major points of contention in dating the Lindau back cover. Some scholars hesitate to put it much before 800 because of the presence of this technique. And finally, you have the chip carved plaques, these extraordinary plaques where an artist has chipped away at the metal to create these designs and then used niello to fill in the recesses in order to make the designs more legible. So these designs are more than just showing off. This requires an incredible amount of artistic skill, of specialized knowledge. Each of these techniques has its own set of connotations, not just in the type of objects they're usually associated with, but also the types of regions that they're associated with. So I mentioned that these medallions, for example, are associated with Viking art. The champlevé enamel here is more associated with Mediterranean or North Italian examples of art. And the chip carved plaques are something we've associated more with insular art. So taken as a whole, this cover is really a quite cosmopolitan object, and something that reflects a real mix of styles and traditions in one piece. So it's natural to ask, where could this be made? Where can we expect to see such a mix of styles and techniques? Well, the closest point of comparison for this back cover is a chalice known as the Tyslo chalice. And it's quite huge. I think it holds over 1 liter of liquid. And this was something that was made around 777 by Duke Tyslo, who was the Duke of Bavaria. And at this time, in the late 8th century, the capital of Bavaria, or the main city in Bavaria, was Salzburg. So that was the center, the artistic center of Bavaria. And Bavaria was an important region because it was nestled between Italy and so northern Italy and northern Europe. And it was an important conduit for exchange and economy through this region. So there's a lot of movement going on in this region, especially from Italy to the north. But Salzburg was also important as the site for missionaries from Ireland, these so-called peregrini that wandered across the continent during the 8th century. The bishop of Salzburg at this time was a man named Virgil, who was an Irish monk. And this is a phenomenon that happened in this region. St. Gall also, for example, was founded by an Irish missionary. So there is reason to have strong insular presence in this region as well. Virgil was actually the tutor of Tyslo, so that's another link between Tyslo and this back cover. And so Tyslo his court is probably the best place that we could locate this spectacular back cover. Not many people hear of Tyslo, and there's a reason for that. He was quite an ambitious person. He was a cousin of Charlemagne, and he was clearly aiming for royal status. He married a Lombard princess, that is a princess from northern Italy. In fact, the inscription on the Tyslo chalice refers to their marriage. He's referred to as a duke, and his wife, Lutberg, is referred to as a royal princess. So here he's showing his status, his aspirations toward royal status. He did all sorts of things, like he had his son baptized in Rome years before Charlemagne would do the same. He also supported the building of Salzburg Cathedral, which at the time was one of the largest buildings in Europe. So he had clear ambitions for greater power and reason to commission spectacular works like these. Charlemagne, he was also one of Charlemagne's biggest rivals. And Charlemagne, through a series of strategic maneuvers, was able to eliminate Tyslo as a threat. He actually forced him into exile. Not only did he force Tyslo into exile, but he also set up a systematic campaign of damnatio memoriae, that is, an eradication of his memory. He sent envoys to confiscate Tyslo's treasures, and he distributed them to his own supporters. So this is the type of scenario where we can imagine a spectacular cover like this being detached from its original context and being given to an institution closely allied to the Carolingians, like St. Gall. Here I'm showing you another example of Lombard art. This is North Italian art, and you could see how this element reflects in the Lindau back cover as well. This is the 7th century cover of the Thelinda Gospels. So the front cover also has, it's not quite as dramatic of a history, but it also has an interesting story of how it came to St. Gall. Again, we have to reconstruct this. We don't have certain evidence telling us one way or the other. So the front cover is quite different in style from the back cover. So where we had in the previous example many different techniques combined together into a single design, here we have a much more unified approach to the metalwork. The material has been reduced to just gold and precious gems, and the other major element is the figural work, which was much less prominent in the Lindau back cover. So the other aspect that's interesting about this front cover is that depending on how you look at it, you can see different elements come out. So if you see it from the side, for example, the cross turns into a series of arcades. And they take on a really architectural quality. And the same goes for the bosses and the corner pieces. And you almost have the sense that you're looking at a cityscape. When you combine this observation with the prominence of the gold, the almost exclusive use of gold, it seems likely that the artist is aiming here for a vision of heavenly Jerusalem, as it's described in the book of Revelation. So in this way, the artist is transforming the crucifixion, which is the main subject of the front cover, into a celestial vision of heaven. It's quite remarkable that the cover here is almost exclusively gold and precious gems. There's no ivory, there's no enamel, there's no ancient cameos or other spolia. It's simply gold, gems, and figural work. And the gems are almost all intact there. So there are very, very few replacements, and they don't seem to be reused ancient cameos as far as we can tell. Another aspect that's interesting about the front cover is the emphasis on Christ's sacrifice, and particularly his blood. You can see the blood falling from his hands and from his side wound here in this detail. And it's for this reason that scholars have suggested that the front cover was likely originally intended for a sacramentary. So a sacramentary is the book that a priest uses to celebrate Mass. And one of the most important prayers in a sacramentary was the Eucharistic prayer. So this marks the moment in the ritual of Mass when the bread and wine are turned into the body and blood of Christ. And this is thematized here on the front cover. And if you think that these blood drops here look like clusters of grapes, I would be with you on that. And that, again, is a sort of Eucharistic reference, combining pointing not just to the blood, but also to the wine. And here you can see the remarkable attention to detail and how well preserved the figures are and how expressive their faces are. There's only slight amounts of damage. You could see Christ's head has been squashed a little bit. So where was this cover made? Well, the closest point of reference is a cover that survives today in Munich. This is the Codex Aureus from St. Emmeram in Regensburg. And this cover was commissioned by Charles the Bald as a gift for St. Emmeram. And we know that this object, this forms a small group of objects, 3 objects in total, of which the Lindau Gospels is one. These objects are very closely related, and it's likely that Charles the Bald, or his workshop, was also involved in the creation of the Lindau front cover. Another piece of evidence linking the Lindau front cover to the workshop of Charles the Bald is this now lost golden altar of Saint-Denis, which was melted down during the French Revolution and survives today. We only know it today through this image in a painting which represents how it looked in the late 15th century. And you could see that this is a golden altar piece. It probably was originally an antipendium. And there are a lot of affinities between the altarpiece and the Lindau front cover. The emphasis on gold and the use of precious gems. And even though this is filtered through a Northern Renaissance painter, you could see some stylistic affinities as well. So scholars are generally of the opinion that the Lindau front cover was the product of the workshop of Charles the Bald. Charles the Bald was the grandson of Charlemagne, and like his grandfather, he was a great patron of manuscripts, and we have many illuminated manuscripts that are associated with him. Now, how did it get to St. Gall? Now here it's a little unclear, but you have to realize that at this time, the Carolingian Empire was splitting, was fracturing into different parts. So Louis the Pious had 3 sons, and each of them inherited their own territory. And of course, they then fought bitterly. And Charles the Bald was often at war with his half-brother, Louis the German. And it may be that through some sort of connections between Charles the Bald and Louis the German, or his son Charles III, this object came into the possession of St. Gall as a gift. So the close relationship with the Munich Codex Aureus is beneficial for us, as it also helps us understand how the Lindau Gospels was made, because this manuscript, the Munich Codex Aureus, underwent a restoration campaign in 1971, where they basically took apart the various parts of the front cover and restored it and analyzed it from a technical perspective, and then put it all back together again. And this was all published in a book, and this allows us to understand how the Lindau Gospel cover may have been constructed. And what appears to be, at first glance, one continuous sheet of metal or one continuous object is most likely actually a set of various smaller components that are very artfully combined and carefully combined so that you don't see the seams or the joins. And this image on the right gives you a good sense of how the figures would have been produced. They would have been punched from the back. And in some cases, a wax mold could be used to help the artist shape the reliefs. And some of those survive in the case of the Munich Codex Aureus. The other thing that is worth mentioning about the Lindau Gospels is, again, with this insistence on gold and and precious gems, it calls to mind a very common medieval statement of artistic excellence, and that is a quotation of Ovid, which is "Materiam superabat opus," the craftsmanship surpasses the material. And this is almost a motto of aesthetic quality in the Middle Ages, this comparison between material value and craftsmanship. And I think that the Lindau front cover in particular really lets this dynamic relationship between matter, gold in this case, and craftsmanship, the figures, come through. Now, when you think about this front cover as really being comprised of many different smaller parts, you start to think about how carefully this must have been put together. And one way of seeing this really considered aspect, this really sophisticated approach to composition, is by looking at how the gems are arranged. And so I'm showing you here an example of how the sapphires are arranged on the front cover. And you could see that the sapphires are really given a place of prominence. They are at the top, at the bottom of the cross, and they really crown the whole composition, I would say. And the pattern is really quite sophisticated. And the sapphires are interesting because each of them is bored through the center in such a way that they may have been part of a necklace, that you can imagine them being strung along as if in a necklace. And this is an idea that actually goes way back to 1846. And we know that the Baron von Lasberg describes this observation in his letter to the Earl of Ashburnham. He suggests that the Empress, that is the wife of Louis the Pious, donated her necklace for the creation of this manuscript. Now that's, of course, legend. We don't know at all who actually donated this necklace, if this is indeed where the stones came from, but it raises an important issue, and that is the economic aspect of this cover. Where did these precious stones come from? They certainly they weren't lying around on the riverbeds of France. These are not locally sourced materials. And in fact, the sapphires in particular probably came from as far away as Sri Lanka or India. So we're talking about a really global network of materials and exchange that is being marshaled here to create this cover. And the potential to have jewelry as a vector for this transfer, I think, is really interesting and makes sense in this context, in this way that you could think of the Lindau front cover as having a votive element as well. That is, somebody donated their own object so that this piece could be created. The same sort of aspect of the network or the global reach of the gospel book comes through with the silk textiles. So these textiles, like the precious gems, could not be locally sourced. In fact, the Carolingians were not able to produce silk. They did not have that technology. The only way to get these textiles was through diplomatic exchanges or marriages or things like that. And this rarity made textiles like this highly coveted items. And we know from texts that diplomatic missions, that during diplomatic exchanges, ambassadors would give gifts like precious wall hangings and textiles, and rulers would in turn cut these up into smaller pieces and give them as gifts to their own supporters. And it's in this context that these precious textiles likely came to St. Gall. In fact, we know that Louis the German, one of the main rulers associated with St. Gall, received ambassadors from Byzantium in the early 870s. And these two textiles are precisely the type of gifts that could result from that sort of exchange. On the left, you're looking at what is believed to be a Byzantine textile of the early 9th century. This is an opinion put forth by Regula Shorta, one of the leading experts on Byzantine textiles. And on the right, it's a little bit more difficult to attribute this textile, but it's often described as being Syrian or Near Eastern, and also from the 8th or 9th century. One thing that I want to point out about the textile on the left is not just the beautiful falcons, which are of course charming, but the monochromatic pattern, which may be hard to see in a photograph, but you could see that there's a design, a repetitive pattern that comes through very slightly. It's almost like a shimmering effect in the silk. And this monochromatic pattern is something that seems to have had a particular impact on Carolingian artists. Now there's one issue with the silk. If you look closely at the Byzantine silk, you'll see underneath there is a piece of marbled paper underneath it. Now this paper, it's hard to gauge just from the little snippets that we can see, but this paper probably dates to the 17th century. I mean, it's we'd have to talk to a specialist about this who knows more about marbled paper, which I do not, but Paul Needham, the author of the Morgan's Catalog of Fine Bindings, suggested that this would have been mid-17th century, which raises a lot of questions. How exactly did it come about that a 17th century piece of marbled paper is underneath a 9th century textile? Well, there's no real clear answer to this, but it may be the case that this is part of another attempt at restoring the textile, which may have been in a somewhat tattered state, and this could have been used as a support for the textile and then repasted down onto the binding. But again, here, this is a point where scholars debate, and some scholars would point to this as evidence that the whole ensemble of the Lindau Gospels was put together at a later date. But really, this use of Byzantine and Near-Eastern textiles for gospel books is something that is very well attested in Carolingian manuscripts. I'm showing you here on the right the inner binding of a gospel book now in Prague, which is roughly contemporary with the Lindau Gospels, that is to say, late 9th century. And you could see its textile is in spectacular condition, really vibrant colors. I can show you many, many more examples of the use of these textiles, particularly for deluxe gospel books in this period. So I think you'd have to balance these observations and imagine a scenario where this object has either been restored in the 16th century, or that an early modern restorer knew enough about the context of 9th century manuscripts and their predilection for Byzantine and Near Eastern textiles to put these objects together, which I find honestly a little bit hard to believe. Another reason to link the textiles to the original moment of the creation of the Lindau Gospels is the spectacular illumination, particularly these 2 pages that you see here on either side of the canon tables. These are completely unique in the history of 9th century painting. There's really nothing else quite like them. They are clearly modeled on textiles, but they're not copies of textiles, and they're certainly not meant to be copies of the textiles in the Lindau Gospels, on the inside cover of the Lindau Gospels, and there's no reason to expect them to be. You could see here that they're framing the canon tables in the same way that the textiles, the actual textiles, frame the book of the Gospels itself. There's also a thematic element to these simulated textile pages. The one on the left, which is toward the exterior of the manuscript, has clear depictions of trees and vegetation and little monsters, which may be sea monsters or types of lions. And the miniature on the right, or the interior of the codex, is more celestial. It's like a starscape. And it may be that there's an intended transition from a terrestrial, as you move into the codex, from a terrestrial setting to a more celestial setting. Now, who could have painted something like this? There's really nothing like it. Who can we attribute this painting to? Well, luckily for us, there is a manuscript that is very closely related to the illumination of the Lindau Gospels. And this book is still in St. Gall today. It's a magnificent psalter called the Fulkart Psalter. And it's named after its artist. And we know the artist because there is a wonderful dedication scene in the manuscript. And you could see here some of the close similarities in the border design, the type of ornament, and they also here is the predilection for abstract, non-figural imagery. Here is the dedication scene of the Fulkart Psalter, and you could see on the left the scribe and artist Fulkart here offering his book to Christ, and on the right there is the patron, the abbot Hartmut of St. Gall at this time, and they're all done in this wonderful metallic style, which is so amazing. And it's this scene that tells us the close links with the Lindau Gospels. It tells us who was like the likely artist of the Lindau Gospels, and it was probably Folkart and some of his assistants. Now, there are other links between the Folkart Psalter and the Lindau Gospels, which really bear this connection out. One of the most important ones, in my opinion, is the use of simulated textile designs in the Folkart Psalter. And if you look here on the left, you see in this purple ground a textile pattern. This is a reflection of the monochromatic designs that I was pointing out in the Byzantine textile earlier. You see in the purple ground 2 different shades of purple being used to create a pattern. Here, this is based on diamond shapes with rosettes. Now, if you look closely at the textile page in the Lindau Gospels, you'll see this is a raking light image, so it's being shot from the side. You can see that this page was ruled using a very special type of diamond pattern. So ruling is when scribes would use a dry point to create grid lines for their compositions or for their text. And this is really a unique pattern here, this diamond-shaped pattern, which determines the composition of the miniature. And you can see some pretty clear links between these 2 pages. So I think we have a good context for relationships between the illumination of the Lindau Gospels and the book as a physical object. One final piece of evidence linking the manuscript itself to the physical object is this page from the Lindau Gospels on the left, which shows a really remarkable abstract depiction of a flared cross that seems to hover between the purple ground and the gold text. And this cross, which is also unlike anything in 9th century painting that I'm aware of, clearly relates to the flared arms of the Lindau back cover. And this, I think, is another important piece of evidence that the illumination was created with these objects in mind. And it seems that Hartmut asked Folkart, as a leading scribe and artist at St. Gall, to create this manuscript as a way of uniting all of these spectacular pieces that St. Gall received as a result of gifts and imperial favors. So that is in essence a brief history of the Lindau Gospels as a composite object. I think that at this point we could open it up for questions. I definitely didn't cover all of the possible features of the book, and I want to stress that there really is a lot left to learn about this manuscript, a lot that we don't know, and a lot of mystery still remains. So at this point, if there are any questions, I'd be happy.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that presentation. We do have some questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time we have. The first one is regarding the back cover. Did they make the repairs on the covers to look different on purpose?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think that we have to think about this in an historical perspective. We can't really expect restorers in the 9th or the 16th century to really attempt to recreate an 8th century style. This would be anachronistic. This is a type of historical awareness that really doesn't come about till well into modernity. So I don't think that we can expect too much that they would have attempted to recreate an original style for the back cover. But what I do think they did was they tried to retain the design. In other words, they didn't try to alter the design of the back cover or change its basic meaning. And that is really remarkable. And you could see this, for example, in the bosses. So we have one boss that survives original, and they were replaced. Nobody tried to add an additional element to the program at this moment. And same thing with these repairs here. So I do think there was an attempt to maintain or retain the design more than the actual style.
Another question is, you had used the term insular. Some of our attendees are asking questions based on, is it influenced by Celtic art or Irish knot art? Could you maybe describe a little bit the terminology of, say, insular art versus Celtic, and the differences, or if any, or the use of terminology?
Yeah, insular is a blanket term that refers to the art of Ireland and the British Isles, and So basically, at this period in Salzburg, but also elsewhere along the continent, from St. Gall to Fulda to Bobbio to Luxeuil, you have a wave, this is in the 8th century, a wave after wave of missionaries coming from Ireland and the British Isles and bringing with them books and art. And there was a real impact, particularly in the region around Salzburg. In fact, some scholars refer to this as an insular art province. And that's not really a historical term. That's really just a way of indicating that there is a profound influence of Irish and insular art in this region. And that reflects not just in the metalwork, but also in the script and in the miniature painting. So if I had more time, I could show you more examples. But we have, for example, one leaf in the Morgan that was long thought to be an insular leaf, but it's actually an 8th century German leaf, we know now. And it's very hard sometimes to distinguish between what some people might think Celtic or insular and what is really art from the continent in this period.
Our next question is sort of a combined as well. What is the weight of the Gospels and the dimensions of it? How big is it?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have the weight off the top of my head, and the dimensions are something like 30 centimeters. I'd have to look up the exact dimensions. It's, I'd say it's about, I'm guessing off the top of my head, like maybe 25 by 30 centimeters, but I'd have to double check that. I should also mention that this manuscript, the Lindau Gospels, is digitized online. So you can look at all of the pages and read the catalog description online.
Our next question is, how can you tell if a gemstone has been replaced?
Oh, okay. So if you look, if I go back to my nope, here we go. Do you see these gemstones here, how they sort of jump out at you? So this is glass. So there's, you could look, there are different ways of telling something has been replaced. Here also, these gems, many of these gems have been replaced. You could tell by the color, and I'm definitely not a gem expert, but when they're replaced, they're often not replaced with precious gems. They're replaced with a material of lesser value, and that really stands out when you have real gems next to them. So it's a matter of really close looking and comparing.
The next question is, and I just lost my place. Are Christ's eyes open on the front cover, and is that significant?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me see, let's take a close look. They do look like they're open. Now the question, so there's a question about whether Christ is depicted as triumphant, alive, or dead. And that's a major turning point in early medieval art, how you depict Christ and which side do you emphasize. The earlier you go, usually he's depicted as a triumphant way to stress the resurrection and the ultimate, the happy ending of this, you could say. And the other way of depicting him as dead stresses the suffering and the sacrifice, and that takes on a more devotional aspect. So I think here we have a little bit more of, from what I could see in this case, a living Christ, but still his suffering is being emphasized through the emphasis on blood.
Unfortunately, for the time, we have time for one more question. Just here, when were the covers most recently restored or conserved at the Morgan?
Oh, so there was an exhibition of treasure bindings at the Morgan in, I believe, 2017. It was called Magnificent Gems. It was put together by my predecessor, Bill Volkley. And for that exhibition, a couple of the treasure bindings were carefully cleaned. So just nothing too invasive, but just slightly removing a little bit of dust and accretions and things like that. And that's the last time they were really handled like that. And they've never really been handled in the way of a major restoration. Like the Lindau Gospels will never be taken apart into its various pieces. That's probably not going to happen.